Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us this lovely morning for a COVID-19 community webinar. I'm Joey. I'm from HealthMetrics. I'll be hosting today's webinar. And it's our privilege and honor to have Dr. Ernest today to speak about COVID-19 vaccination. A brief introduction on Dr. Ernest. He's a consultant respiratory physician in UMMC and UMSC. He's currently an associate professor in Faculty of Medicine in UC Malaya. During this time, he's also co-managed COVID positive patients in UMNC. He treats various diseases regarding to the respiratory and sleep condition, and he has an interest in lung cancer and also COPD. Without much further ado, we're just going to start the webinar. There are a lot of questions we have received the past over a week ago, up till yesterday. So we want to utilize this time to ask as many questions as possible to Dr. Ernest. Good morning, Dr. Ernest. Thank you for joining us today for this community webinar. I'm just going to start off with, so you, in your biography, you mentioned about handling COVID-19 patient. What was your experience like?
Oh, okay. So we started off with the first MCO last year when it first came to Malaysia, and things were pretty scary back then. We didn't know what the transmission of the virus was. It transmitted via droplets, via airborne, and we had to take a very strict conditions to manage patients who were infected with the virus. As the numbers slowly climbed and more research came into the modes of transmission, we became more efficient in knowing how to isolate patients, knowing how to protect ourselves as well, because during then there were a lot of hospital transmissions as well, because we sometimes patients would come in would be negative upfront, but then they become positive much later. So there was a few outbreaks in a few wards. But since then, we have managed to create a system that is more efficient to identify patients who we suspect to have COVID-19, even though their symptoms may be a little bit unusual. And of course, most of the healthcare workers would have been vaccinated by now. So the level of fear or apprehension towards managing these patients have become much more tolerable or much reduced in recent months.
Oh, that's good to hear. So you mentioned about the frontliners, the medical personnel being vaccinated, and now everyone is talking about the vaccine itself. You want to share a bit of your own experience of how was it like for you when you get your vaccination?
The Pfizer vaccine has a very good efficacy, and although it's relatively quite a new technology using the mRNA technology to produce the vaccine, throughout their clinical trials that has been published in many international journals, the reported side effects are very, the common ones you will meet, but then the rare side effects are very unusual. And it was the right thing to do at that point of time, because if you calculate the risk of this being exposed to any patients potentially having COVID and getting COVID itself, it makes a lot of sense to get the vaccine, regardless of the very rare side effects that you may potentially encounter with the vaccine.
Right. There's a questions from the audience. Yes, we will be accepting questions during this session, so feel free to put your questions on the live Q&A, and we will answer them accordingly. So thank you so much, Doctor, for sharing with us your experience on how was it like getting the vaccine, and how was your experience handling it in the first place. We're really glad that the frontliners like yourself are vaccinated, and thank you so much for all you have done throughout this past 1 year. I'm sure it's not easy, and with current MCO, it's probably more difficult on your end. We're just going to pick some questions from the audience. I do know there's so much of recently we just have the voluntary registration for Astra-Zeneca vaccine, and people have putting questions about the differences. Just now you mentioned about Pfizer having a lot of research being done, and the risks are really low as compared to the advantages of having a vaccine. So could you tell us the difference between like a Pfizer and a Sinovac and an Astra-Zeneca vaccines?
Okay, so broadly speaking, there are, three types of COVID vaccines that are in the market at the moment. So I've already mentioned one of them, which is the mRNA vaccine, which Pfizer and Moderna uses. So just briefly speaking, the mRNA vaccine contains an mRNA, which is like a messenger piece to synthesize a messenger gene to synthesize a part of the spike protein that is present on the coronavirus. So when you inject the mRNA, of course, it's enclosed in a nanolipid particle, and to protect the mRNA gene, the cell that it gets injected to will absorb the mRNA, and then it will start to produce the protein so that the spike protein appears on the outer part of the cell. So it mimics, it's sort of like a coronavirus in disguise. It uses a normal cell, make it to look like a coronavirus, so that the immune system would be able to identify that as foreign and develop antibodies towards it. So that's the mRNA vaccine. We have the AstraZeneca as well as the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, which will be coming in, as well as our Sputnik V vaccine from Russia, which uses the technology of viral vectors. Now, viral vectors uses either a human different type of virus called adenovirus, and for the AstraZeneca vaccine, they get the adenovirus from the chimpanzee. Whereas from the other vaccines like the Sputnik V as well as the Johnson & Johnson vaccines, they would use adenovirus from humans that are known to infect humans, and so these are human adenovirus. What they would do is this virus would become vectors or carriers. They will carry the DNA, a part of the DNA of the COVID-19 virus into the body. So they behave like a carrier, just like a train transporting a DNA into our system. So these viruses have been genetically modified so that they do not replicate in our human cell. That means they do not replicate and infect us and cause symptoms. They behave solely as a carrier. So what is important is the DNA that is within this virus. The DNA again encodes the spike protein, a part of the protein of the coronavirus itself. When it gets injected in the body, our cells absorb this virus, absorb the virus into the body. The part of the DNA actually goes into the nucleus of the cell, and from there it gets translated into the mRNA, which we mentioned just now as the Pfizer and the Moderna vaccines. The mRNA comes out of the nucleus, goes into the other parts of the cell, and that's where the protein is produced. And then similarly, the protein gets expressed on the cell. The cell becomes like a virus in disguise, and then the body activates an immune system towards the spike protein of that infected cell. So because the DNA is used in this sort of method, this sort of vaccine is more stable, because mRNA gets, if there's any change in temperature, they need to be stored in -70 degrees in the Pfizer vaccine. And if there is any change in it, the mRNA will disintegrate or will become, there will be damages done to it, and it will not be able to do what it's supposed to do. Whereas the DNA vaccine is more rugged, so it can tolerate higher temperatures, and that's why the AstraZeneca vaccine does not need to be stored in below freezing temperatures.
Okay, that's very informative, Doctor. Yes, please continue. It's just good to know that. Yeah. Sorry, please continue.
No problem. So the last type of vaccine is the inactivated vaccines, which China are known for. And the inactivated vaccines are the oldest form of technology used to produce vaccines, where we actually take the virus itself, inactivate it or kill it, and then through processing, we inject it into the human body, and our human would recognize the virus as foreign and develop antibody towards the virus itself. So it's the oldest method of producing vaccines. Most of our other vaccines are produced this way. So those are the three sort of methods that or technology that are being used for the vaccines these days.
Then I'm going to ask you a question. Thank you so much for explaining the differences between Pfizer, Sinovac, and Astra-Zeneca. Would you, in your opinion, is one more superior, or do you think most of them are just equal? It's just different technology, but they have the same efficiency?
So with each vaccine, obviously the efficacy or how effective the vaccine is able to protect a person from a symptomatic transmission or an asymptomatic transmission differs. So you have different rates of efficacy for different types of vaccines. But the important thing is to note that this is not a competition between trying to get the best, most efficacious vaccine out there. The concept is that we are trying to vaccinate as many as people as possible to protect those people that we cannot vaccinate at the moment. So this is what we are hearing very common nowadays, called herd immunity. So that is what we are trying to do. We're trying to vaccinate as many as possible using whatever vaccines that we have, in order to try to achieve that 70 to 80% protection of the community, so that the other 20% of the community that cannot be vaccinated will be protected.
So, Doctor, it's good that you mentioned about herd immunity, and we need to achieve 80% in Malaysia in order to protect the 20%. Could you explain more who should not take the vaccine or who can't take the vaccines?
Okay, so at the moment, I think this question is a bit of a double-edged sword at the moment, because at the moment we don't have enough supply of the vaccine. So actually it's that a lot of people want the vaccine, but they can't get hold of the vaccine at the moment. So but if, let's say, vaccines are available, like there is, oops, I'm breaking up. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
I can still
okay, so
hear
let's say if there is endless supplies of vaccine and supply is not an issue, then people who would be a bit more cautious include children at the moment. There is no data for vaccinating children below the age of 12 at the moment. Pfizer has just came out, recently, that they have data for vaccinating children above 12 years of age now. And so in the US, I think FDA may be approving an indication to vaccinate teenagers above the age of 12. And they are also looking at clinical trials to determine the safety in children below 12, from 5 years old to 12 years old at the moment. But because this group of population, in children, when they actually do get infected with COVID-19, the death rates are very, very low, and they don't run into that much complication. So of course, there's this issue about, with the global shortage of vaccines, whether it's actually right to vaccinate children when actually there are a lot of people dying from COVID without protection because of a shortage of supply of vaccine. So this is one issue that I think the United States has to address. There are also new data on pregnant women. So again, I think Pfizer seems to be leading the game against testing in special population groups, although AstraZeneca has also started to do these trials. And of course, phase 2 clinical trials so far has shown that there are no safety alerts to be concerned when the pregnant women were vaccinated with COVID-19. So I guess all these are just off indication labels at the moment, and we will not recommend these to anyone who is pregnant or breastfeeding or lactating, and children at the moment, unless your risk is really, really very, very high. For example, if you are a health worker who is pregnant and you are working in India at the moment, and everywhere is just COVID. And I think for women, if they who are pregnant, and if they do get COVID-19, the complications are very, very high. They can run into all sorts of problems, including premature delivery, They can get into blood clots and all sorts of issues. So if you are, let's say, a healthcare worker and you happen to be pregnant in India, obviously, you know, you will be using the vaccine under emergency conditions. And even though there is no safety data available, you would know that the chances of you getting COVID and the complications that would arise would be much, much higher than whatever vaccines that you are taking.
Right, doctor. So you mentioned, would your advice be for pregnant and breastfeeding? So you mentioned Pfizer have done some studies on it, and Astra is looking into doing that study. So what would
They have already started. They have already started. Yeah.
So what would be a simple advice? Will it be if you're pregnant or planning to get pregnant, or you're breastfeeding, would you advise them to go get a vaccine?
So far in Malaysia, and of course these are not indicated, they are not approved by the National Regulatory Agency at the moment. Even in the FDA has not approved this group of population to be used on this vaccine. So all this should not be promoted and not to be encouraged at the moment, because we do not have enough data. So people who are planning to get pregnant, or who are pregnant, or who are lactating or breastfeeding, then this group of patients should avoid the vaccines at the moment until further data is available.
That's very helpful information, doctor, because I guess this is the group of people we want to protect as well. So essentially what you're saying, like if you're healthy and you have no any severe allergies, you should get vaccinated to protect those who can't take the vaccine, for example, getting pregnant or lactating women, right?
So even for allergies, I think let's briefly talk about allergies. I think allergies, unless there is obviously you would get assessed during your vaccination, but allergies itself is not a contraindication to vaccination. You can still get your vaccine, and there would be a 30-minute observation period after the vaccine, because usually allergic reactions or even more severe anaphylactic just means very, very severe allergic reactions happen within the first few minutes after getting a vaccine. So this group of patients would be monitored very, very carefully, as well as there will be medical people on standby to give the first line medications to counter any severe allergic reactions. Again, the allergic reactions that have been reported across phase 3 clinical trials have been very, very low.
Okay. I hope that answers some of the questions. And this was a question submitted from the form from the audience. If I was infected with COVID-19 previously, does that mean I don't need to take the COVID-19 vaccine because I have the antibody?
Okay, so yes, a very, very good question. So as you know, as our numbers are climbing at the moment as we speak, most hospitals and ICUs would be full with COVID patients. You may have some friends who have actually had COVID as well. I mean, this round, I think it seems to come a little bit nearer to me. Some of my friends who had contracted COVID, whereas the last round, a lot of them were like, second degree, third degree, or I met somebody who had a contact with COVID. But this round, there were a lot more close people that came down with COVID. So the question is, natural immunity would definitely occur, but nobody knows how long the natural immunity will last. So it may be 3 months, it may be 6 months. Nobody knows how long the natural immunity will last. So that's why it is still recommended that even if you have had a COVID infection, the CDC recommends that you do not get vaccinated in the immediate event. So you should wait for all the acute event to settle. But of course, different guidelines have different recommendations, and it's generally quite safe to take the vaccine after 14 days, or some people would recommend even a 90 days wait after after you contracted COVID. But it is important also, as I said just now, it's not so much, these guidelines can be just guidelines, they are recommendations, but you also need to assess how risky you are of getting COVID again, because there are cases of reinfection. So of course, if the community transmission of COVID is very, very high at that point of time, and you just recovered from COVID, there's no data to suggest that you may not get COVID again within the next 1 month. You may still be infected. So if this is the case, then we would also recommend vaccination at this point of time.
Okay. Then the next question you talk about, immunity, right? So in the previous question, you talk about herd immunity. So a lot of people talk about herd immunity these days. And so why do we not talk about this before that? Like for example, flu virus, right? Flu virus mutates every year. We did had an influenza H1N1 outbreak last year, January. Could you just explain more? What if someone wants to take a flu vaccine, but at the same time they had a COVID-19 vaccine? What are the gaps for different vaccines? So do I have to wait a few weeks or a few months before I take COVID-19 vaccine if I have a flu vaccine? Yeah.
So a very good question as well. And we do get that quite often. So so the flu vaccine, as you know, or the influenza vaccine is given on a yearly basis. Once a year, you would get a vaccine that is dependent on the strain that is more prevalent either in the southern or the northern hemisphere, and the vaccine lasts for a year. So if you happen to have a influenza vaccine, and you registered for your COVID vaccine and that happens, you need to give a time frame of about 2 weeks. That is what CDC recommends. Although in general, there's still, and the 2 weeks is just because there is not much data available on whether there could be any potential interactions between the two vaccines. But of course, again, guidelines differ across the world. In the UK, for example, they see no reason why you should delay the vaccine. If you can get both of it at the same time, they do not make a specific recommendation against that. But in the US, the CDC do recommend that you at least wait for 14 days after you have gotten any other types of vaccines.
Great. So now we talk about the gap, and it's really a case-to-case basis. I think there's a lot of questions on a lot of us, even myself. Like, if I get a COVID-19 vaccine, how long will it last in my body?
Okay, Joey, just before we touched on that, I think just to elaborate more on, I think your previous question on why we do not talk about herd immunity with other sorts of viruses, for example, the influenza. Why do we not try to achieve herd immunity with just by vaccinating everybody with the influenza virus? And that's because certain types of virus mutates at a very, very fast rate compared to, of course, you have seen the coronavirus itself we have had some funny strains coming in recently. But those other viruses, they mutate too fast for you to develop a vaccine fast enough to be able to cover the different types that are out there. So you have the pneumococcal vaccine, you have the influenza vaccine, and all this is difficult to achieve herd immunity with those because the virus just mutates too quickly and changes too fast. And so what is important is to protect people who are vulnerable. So we promote the influenza vaccine or the pneumococcal vaccine towards people who are at risk.
Okay.
Okay, now back to your question.
Now back to the question.
What was it about again?
It was because we talk about immunity so much that, I think it's a lot in our head that, like, how long does this COVID-19 vaccine immunity last? No one knows. So, like, I wanted to hear from your opinion. Yeah.
Yes, and you're right that there are not enough data at the moment because the vaccines only started rolling out globally, I think middle of last year, which was around June or July. And at this moment, we are only about maybe about the 10th month or the 11th month mark of the vaccines itself. And I think a lot of studies are still being done to see how immunogenic the vaccines are, which means how long the vaccines can trigger immune response. But it is generally said to be quite long because our body does have a memory cell that actually remembers how the spike protein looks like and develops antibodies towards it. So the memory B cells or the immune cells that we have actually do play a very big part in us maintaining immunity towards the virus itself. So it's generally postulated anywhere above 6 months or even 9 or even up to a year. So I mean, we need to wait for more data to come on the different types of vaccines. And of course, different vaccines may potentially trigger different form of different types of immunogenicity. And of course, the duration whether a booster shot is needed. All this will come to play as time goes on.
Right. And now we talk just on the questions about immunity, and we are not sure until we observe much later, right? It feels like, the whole world is an experiment in itself. So another one of the question came from the floor was that once we're vaccinated, let's say, like you mentioned just now, this time around, the wave of COVID-19, they're just people we know they are infected, like like you mentioned, your friends, and I personally have friends who are infected as well. And what happens if we come close contact with a positive patient, even though when we're already vaccinated? Is it possible to be reinfected? Yeah.
Well, so again, even if you have been vaccinated, as I said, the vaccine is not 100% efficacy. You still have a small percentage that you may potentially be infected with COVID. But however, the vaccine protects you from the serious side effects of the virus itself, because your body would have already developed antibodies developed to kill the virus before it infects your lungs or more or cause havoc in different parts of the body. So definitely you would be able to protect yourself against the serious side effects. Now, how much at risk of you getting the virus itself? Again, it comes down to the SOP that we have been hearing over and over and over again. Did both of you wear a mask at that time when you meet? And how long did you meet? Was it in close contact? Were you eating together? I think eating is a very high transmission factor, because when you eat, you talk and you take down your mask. And so if someone is positive in front of you, the risk of transmission is very, very high. And that's why I think the government has to close the dine-in at the moment when the cases are so high, because the transmission during eating is very, very high. So just to quote an example, I had a friend who was just having a meal with someone who didn't know he was positive, and then after that he contracted COVID himself. So this is how dangerous the virus is. It has a very high transmission rate if you're not doing certain things like wearing a mask to protect. The wearing of the mask actually protects other people from you. If let's say you didn't know that you have a virus, and you are trying to prevent the transmission of the virus to that person. So, so all this SOP, strict hand hygiene, everything still has to maintain, even though you have been vaccinated. It just reduces your risk of getting infected, but also getting the serious side effects of the vaccines, of the vaccines.
It's okay. I think just because you use that word so much, and I'm sure you use it every single day.
And they both start with B.
Yes. So like you mentioned, I really wish your friend just get well soon. And there are a lot of questions for IC that's published on AstraZeneca. So I think it's just all the buzz this week because we just started the voluntary vaccination for AstraZeneca this week.
Yes.
So one of the questions from the audience was, is it safe for senior citizens?
Okay. Right. So generally, all these vaccines are used in emergency conditions, and we don't really have long-term data on the side effects of the vaccines. Just pertaining now to the AstraZeneca vaccine. So a lot of hype has been on this vaccine because of the incidence of some blood clots within a certain population of people. So in the UK, they have vaccinated almost more than 20 million people now with AstraZeneca vaccines. And out of this, there was a reported incidence of 79 cases, more in the women as well as in the younger age group, of which about 19 of them actually passed away due to the complication of the clot. Now, whether the vaccine, the authorities have not said that there is a direct causal relationship. That means you can't just say in a statement that, oh, AstraZeneca vaccine causes blood clots. That's a very, very not evidence-based thing to say.
Fake news.
But there is some correlations between the two of them, because these blood clot events has also been seen in the Johnson & Johnson vaccine itself, which uses the viral vector technology. So a lot of scientists are looking at all this reported adverse events and trying to see what could possibly be the underlying factor that triggers off this rare clotting event. Now, the majority of age group that has been, of the adverse events were usually in the younger population group. In the younger patients, on 20 to 29 onwards, and then 30 to 39, you can see that the risk of getting a clot is, although still very, very rare, it is generally a bit higher than the older population age group. So it hovers somewhere around 8 to 11 per million people that you vaccinate if you are young within the 20 to maybe 40 age group. And as you grow older, the incidence of blood clots in this group of patients actually drops to very, very low, to about maybe 4 in a million. That's what has been reported in your media. You see 4 in a million. That is the age group that is usually above 50 years old. And so for a lot of countries, they actually do, for example, in Australia, they actually reserve the AstraZeneca vaccines for people above the age of 50. So that is why towards that question, whether it's safe for people who are older, actually the safest group to get this group of this type of vaccine is actually those above the age of 50. But we do see in this voluntary sign up that a lot of young people who are in
Yes.
phase 3 have signed up as either a reflex response or just maybe, as you have pointed out, whether they are tech savvy and they've just rushed to get the AstraZeneca vaccine.
Yeah. So you hear it from Dr. Paul. Sign up your parents, sign up your grandmother and grandfather for the next batch of vaccine. Yeah, another question that from the audience was, so with having vaccines, whether it's Pfizer or AZ or Sinovac, is it still effective in preventing hospitalization and death in the face of the current variants in the country? I think that's a very good question.
Yeah. So I've generally said that they do protect you against the serious side effects of the virus itself. So across all the clinical trials, people who have been vaccinated, there was a significant drop in hospitalizations due because of, as a result of side effects of if you do contract COVID and you need to be hospitalized, all these incidences were much lower in the arm that was vaccinated with vaccines. So they do protect you against the side effects of COVID, the serious side effects of COVID itself.
Okay. So just now you mentioned about, how vaccines protect, and you talk about immunity, and how some virus, for example, like influenza, mutates too fast for vaccines to develop. So there is some buzz going on right now where they ask about, if I take a COVID-19 vaccine, will it be against certain variants? Like now we have the India variants, we have the South Africa variants, we have the UK variants. Will it still be effective to these variants?
Yeah, so I think just to correct a little bit on what you pointed out about the influenza. So it mutates so fast, there are vaccines available. It's just that we can't achieve herd immunity because you may be protected against a certain strain, but you will not be protected against a certain strain. So the same question applies to COVID as well. So far, all the mutations, they don't mutate as fast as some other viruses like influenza, but so far the strains that have been coming in and research has been done on this, the vaccines do protect so far against the strains that have been reported, although because these strains are only in certain parts of the world at the moment, and they are slowly creeping into other countries. To do a clinical trial, to design a clinical trial just for that strain itself, or just for that, it's going to take time, and it's going to be quite difficult. So they have done it to the
I guess.
correct. They have to replicate the whole entire clinical trial again to see whether it protects against a particular strain. So for the time being, experts believe that these vaccines do protect against the strains, but nobody knows, in the future, if the virus manages to mutate again and comes out with a super virulent strain that the vaccine will not be able to protect against. So this is still something of research and questions.
Oh, wow. So many questions in the air. A lot of questions are very concerned about their parents. So one of the couple of questions we received from the audience was that some of their parents or close one have heart-related issues, or they had a bypass, and they are concerned about the vaccine towards their heart health. Any general advice on that? Yeah.
So far, we do have a lot of data from the US vaccines on patients with comorbidities. Comorbidities meaning that they have an underlying medical problem. It could be diabetes, it could be high blood pressure, it could be a cardiovascular problem, it could be a lung problem, or it could be a kidney problem. A lot of these patients are recommended to get the vaccine, because obviously if they do encounter COVID itself, they will get a lot of they will get into big trouble. So it is generally very, very safe for them to get the vaccines. However, if we are talking about certain vaccines like those from the China vaccines, we need to look into detail because a lot of, some of the China vaccines do not have a lot of data on patients with comorbidities. So it's a very small of patients. They look, a lot of them look at patients who are obese, and obesity is a comorbidity. But when you dive down a little bit deeper into the different patients with comorbidities, I think a lot of scrutiny we have to look at those sort of data. And some of these data have not been published in peer-reviewed international journals. So we do have some, but we do not have enough. So again, it is too early to say whether there are potentially any side effects that may occur. But generally, this group of patients, if you weigh the risk versus the risk of getting COVID and the complications that can potentially occur versus the side effects that can potentially occur as well, then obviously you will know which arm to follow. So generally, this is not a medical advice and not a blanket rule for every single patient out there, and this is not intended to be a medical consult as well. So it is always good to check back with the doctor that is treating you whether a certain type of vaccine is not recommended for you. And also on that day when you are actually at the National Vaccination Center, a lot of these details would be screened through and you would be attended to by a doctor as well, and medical personnel as well. And if there is any doubts of a certain type of vaccine not being suitable for you, they would usually not recommend you for that vaccine on that day. So these are also things to be aware about. However, generally across all the vaccines so far, these group of patients remain at high risk if they do develop COVID, and the general recommendation is to go for the vaccination. So there is no issues with patients who are on blood thinners. For example, if they have a heart problem, and they are on aspirin or on warfarin or even the direct oral anticoagulant. For example, the European Society of Cardiology recommends COVID-19 vaccination for all these patients. The standard procedure would be to use a very small needle, about 23 gauge needle, and to apply firm compression at the area for 2 minutes after the injection to prevent any bleeding at that area. The patients may potentially get a bruise or even a swelling at the area because they're on blood thinners, but usually the complications are not severe. Yeah.
Okay. Oh, thank you for answering that question.
If you found this video helpful, do share it out with your friends. Till we meet again,